Nathan Reynolds was a man who seemingly had it all. At 40 years old, he was a highly successful businessman in New York City, commanding respect in the corporate world. His days were meticulously scheduled, packed with back-to-back meetings, financial negotiations, and high-stakes decisions that left little room for anything else. From the moment he stepped out of his penthouse apartment in the morning to the late hours he spent at his sleek, modern office, Nathan was always in motion. His phone buzzed relentlessly with emails and notifications, his calendar overflowed with commitments, and his mind raced with the pressures of maintaining his status at the top. Over the years, work had consumed him. He thrived on the adrenaline of closing major deals, the rush of outperforming competitors, and the satisfaction of seeing his name on the Forbes list. But in this pursuit of success, he had unconsciously let go of the smaller things, the everyday moments that once held meaning. Family dinners had become a distant memory. Weekend calls to his mother, once a habit, had faded into an afterthought. Birthdays, holidays, even simple check-ins. Everything was sacrificed for his relentless ambition. Nathan justified it to himself, thinking, "I'll make time later." But in the fast-paced world he lived in, later never came. There was always another meeting, another project, another reason to push personal matters aside. And so, without realizing it, he had drifted further and further from the people who mattered most. Nathan's mother, Eleanor Reynolds, was 68 years old and lived alone in the small town where he had grown up. Her modest home, filled with old photographs and quiet memories, often felt too big for just one person. Every evening, she would sit in her favorite chair by the window, phone in hand, waiting for the moment she could hear her son's voice. She called him every night, never missing a day. At first, she would wait patiently, letting the phone ring until it went to voicemail. Then she would try again, hoping that this time he would pick up. Most nights, Nathan's phone would buzz on his desk in the middle of a meeting, on a call with a client, or while reviewing documents. He would glance at the screen, see Mom calling, and let it ring. If he answered, it was always the same response. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. I'll call you later." But later never came. She left voicemails, her voice soft, but filled with warmth. "Nathan, I just wanted to hear your voice for a little bit. It's getting cold now. Are you wearing something warm? I miss you." She sent texts, simple and full of love, but they remained unread or quickly skimmed over. Nathan would see the notifications, feel a brief twinge of guilt, and tell himself, "I'll reply later." But in his world, later was always another day, another excuse. And so the calls kept coming, unanswered, until one day they stopped. Nathan's life was a whirlwind of deadlines, negotiations, and high-profile meetings. His days were spent in towering glass offices where multi-million-dollar contracts were signed over power lunches and corporate handshakes. His evenings were often filled with elaborate dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, surrounded by clients and business partners, discussing market trends and profit margins over expensive wine. His world was fast, demanding, and relentless. There was always a deal to close, an investor to impress, a competitor to outrun. Success consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. Meanwhile, in a quiet town miles away, Eleanor's world moved at a different pace. Her days were simple: grocery shopping at the local market, tending to the flowers in her small garden, watching reruns of old family sitcoms. But her evenings were always the same. She would set the table for one, placing her plate neatly in front of her as she sat at the old wooden dining table. The food was warm, but her heart was heavy. Beside her plate, her phone lay silent, waiting. She would glance at the screen now and then, hoping for a call, a message, anything from her son. But the silence stretched on. As Nathan dined under crystal chandeliers in New York, laughing with clients and toasting to another successful deal, Eleanor sat alone, stirring her soup, whispering to herself, "Maybe tomorrow he'll call." That evening, Eleanor called more times than usual. Her frail fingers hovered over the phone screen as she dialed her son's number, her heart quietly hoping that tonight he would answer. The first call went unanswered, as always. She tried again, then again. Nathan's phone vibrated on his desk, lighting up with Mom calling. He was in the middle of reviewing a contract, his mind fully occupied with numbers and clauses. He glanced at the screen, sighed, and without thinking, pressed the side button to silence the call. "I'll call her back later," he muttered to himself, shifting his focus back to work. But later never came. On the other end, Eleanor stared at her phone, watching as the call ended once again. She placed it gently beside her, her shoulders sinking. With a soft, tired sigh, she whispered, "Maybe tomorrow." She didn't know that tomorrow wouldn't come, and Nathan didn't know that this was the last time his mother would ever call him. Nathan's morning began like any other. The soft hum of the city outside his penthouse window blended with the distant honking of taxis and the rhythmic clicking of heels on the pavement below. He brewed his usual black coffee, strong, no sugar, before settling into his chair, flipping open his laptop. His inbox was flooded with emails, project updates, contract revisions, meeting reminders. His calendar was packed, leaving no room for distractions. He skimmed through stock market trends, checking for shifts that might affect his latest investments. By mid-morning, he was in back-to-back meetings, first with his executive team, then with potential investors. Lunch was a rushed affair, a high-protein salad at his desk while he reviewed financial reports. The afternoon was spent navigating corporate negotiations, sealing yet another lucrative deal. As night fell, Nathan finally returned home, exhausted but satisfied with the day's accomplishments. He tossed his suit jacket over the back of a chair, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and collapsed onto the couch. That was when he noticed it, his phone lying face down on the coffee table, blinking with a notification. One missed call, one new voicemail. His eyes flickered over the caller ID. It was from his mother's number. He let out a small sigh, assuming it was another message from her, another gentle reminder of her presence. He almost ignored it, almost. But something, an unshakable feeling in his chest, told him to listen. So he pressed play. Nathan pressed play, expecting to hear his mother's familiar, gentle voice, perhaps another one of her soft reminders, a simple, "Nathan, call me when you have time." But instead, the voice that came through the speaker was not hers. "Hello, this is Nurse Collins from St. Mary's Hospital." Nathan froze. "Your mother was admitted earlier this morning. She tried calling you several times." His breath caught in his throat. The room around him felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. "I'm very sorry to inform you, she didn't make it." The words slammed into him like a physical blow. Nathan sat there, phone pressed against his ear, his body completely still, his mind refusing to process what he had just heard. This can't be right, he thought. This isn't how this happens. His fingers trembled as he replayed the message, hoping, desperately, that he had misheard, that it had somehow been a mistake. "Your mother didn't make it." The room felt deathly silent. The distant hum of the city outside was gone. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall no longer registered in his mind. His heartbeat pounded violently in his ears, his vision blurring as his grip tightened around the phone. A strangled breath left his lips. His body slumped forward, elbows digging into his knees as his free hand clutched at his forehead. She was gone, and he never answered her calls. Nathan's hands shook as he booked the first available flight home. The details on the screen blurred through the haze of his grief, but his fingers moved instinctively, selecting the earliest departure, paying whatever price necessary. Nothing else mattered. He barely remembered getting to the airport. The taxi ride, the check-in process, even the moments waiting at the gate, all passed in a disconnected blur. The only thing grounding him was the cold weight of his phone in his hand. Seated by the window on the plane, he barely noticed the hum of the engines or the quiet conversations around him. His eyes remained locked on the screen, his thumb hovering over the endless string of messages from his mother. "Nathan, I just wanted to hear your voice for a little bit. It's getting cold now. Are you wearing something warm? I miss you." Each message hit like a dagger to his chest. His mother had sent them with nothing but love, patience, and the hope that her son would reply. And yet, he never did. His vision blurred as a tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it away roughly, but another followed. Nathan had spent his entire life chasing success, believing there would always be time for everything else. Now, staring at the unanswered messages on his screen, he realized the truth. There was no more time. Nathan stepped out of the taxi, his feet heavy against the familiar pavement of his childhood home. The house stood just as it always had, small, modest, with its white picket fence slightly worn from the years. The porch light flickered softly, casting a dim glow over the front steps. It was exactly as he remembered, but something was different. It was too quiet. He hesitated at the door, his fingers lingering over the handle before finally pushing it open. The scent of home hit him instantly: warm wood, old books, and a faint trace of lavender, the same fragrance his mother had always used. Everything was untouched. Her slippers were still neatly placed by the entrance. A half-knitted scarf lay draped over the armrest of her favorite chair. The living room clock ticked softly, filling the silence that pressed against him. Then, his eyes fell on the dining table. A single plate sat there, covered with a small cloth to keep the food warm. His mother had set a place for him, even though she knew he wasn't coming. His breath hitched as he stepped closer. The meal was simple: steamed rice, stir-fried vegetables, and his favorite braised pork, the dish she always made when he was little. She had waited for him. Nathan gripped the back of the chair, his legs suddenly weak. Guilt clawed at his chest as he lowered himself into the seat. His hands trembled as he lifted the cloth, revealing a still warm meal meant for a son who never arrived. Tears welled in his eyes. She had known he wouldn't come, and yet she had cooked for him anyway. A gentle knock on the door pulled Nathan from his grief. He wiped his eyes quickly, composing himself before opening it. Standing there was Mrs. Lawson, the elderly woman who had lived next door to his mother for decades. Her kind face was lined with deep concern, and in her wrinkled hands she held a neatly folded envelope. "Nathan," she said softly, her voice filled with sympathy, "your mother asked me to give this to you if anything ever happened to her." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. His gaze dropped to the envelope, his name written in his mother's delicate, familiar handwriting. His hands trembled as he reached out, taking it gingerly, as if the paper itself might shatter under the weight of his emotions. "She wrote it a few days ago," Mrs. Lawson continued. "She told me she had a feeling you'd need it." Nathan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him. Mrs. Lawson placed a gentle hand on his arm, giving him a small, knowing nod before stepping away. Nathan stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring down at the letter. The edges of the envelope were slightly worn, as if his mother had held onto it for a while, hesitating before sealing her final words inside. With shaky hands, he turned back into the house and sat down at the dining table, the same table where his mother had left his last meal waiting for him. He ran his fingers over the writing on the envelope, tracing the curves of his name as if he could somehow feel her presence in the ink. His heart pounded as he carefully tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, and at the top, in her handwriting, were the words, "To my dearest Nathan." To my dearest Nathan, by the time you read this, I may not be here anymore. But that's okay. A mother's love never truly leaves. It lingers in the little things, the memories, the quiet moments that stay with you long after she is gone. I remember when you were a boy, running home from school with your backpack bouncing on your shoulders. I would wait by the window, watching for you, smiling the moment I saw you turn the corner. You would burst through the door, excitedly telling me about your day, your words tumbling over each other. Those afternoons were my favorite, just the two of us, talking, laughing, sharing. Do you remember the meals I used to make for you? Your favorite? Braised pork with rice? You always said mine was better than any restaurant. I kept making it, even when you got older, even when you were too busy to come home for dinner. Just in case. I know you've been busy, Nathan. I know your world moves fast, and there is always something demanding your time. I never wanted to be a burden, so I stopped calling as often, but I still waited every evening, hoping to hear your voice. And now, I suppose I won't get that chance. But don't be sad, my son. I want you to be happy. I have always been proud of you. No matter how far you go, no matter how many calls go unanswered, you will always be my boy. I have always waited for you to call back, but I know you were busy. If you are happy, then that is enough for me. With all my love, Mom. Nathan walked into St. Mary's Hospital, his steps slow, heavy, as if the weight of his guilt had settled into his very bones. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold, sterile glow over the white tiled floors. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, yet all he could feel was emptiness. At the reception desk, he hesitated before asking, "I'd like to speak to the nurse who was with my mother, Eleanor Reynolds." His voice was hoarse, strained. The receptionist nodded, made a quick call, and within minutes, a woman in a light blue uniform approached. "You must be Nathan," she said gently. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I was with your mother in her final moments," the nurse continued, her eyes filled with warmth and sympathy. "She was very kind. She spoke about you a lot." Nathan's throat tightened. She talked about me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded. "She held onto her phone the entire time," she said softly. "She kept checking the screen, waiting for your call." The words hit Nathan like a knife to the chest. She waited for me?" His voice cracked. "Yes," the nurse confirmed. "Even when she got weaker, she refused to put the phone down. She said she knew you were busy but that you'd call when you could." Nathan's legs gave out, and he sank onto the nearest chair. A sob broke free from his throat, raw and unrestrained. His mother had spent her last moments waiting for a call that never came. His hands covered his face, his body trembling as tears streamed down. "I should have answered," he whispered. "I should have called her back." But now, it was too late. That night, exhaustion finally overtook Nathan, and he collapsed onto his childhood bed. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, unsettling. His body ached with grief, his mind clouded with memories he could no longer change. At some point, sleep took him. In his dream, he was no longer in his bed but back in the old living room, the one from his childhood, where warm light filtered through the windows and the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. Everything looked just as it had decades ago, untouched by time. And there, sitting in her favorite rocking chair, was his mother. She looked as he remembered, soft gray hair neatly pulled back, warm eyes filled with kindness, hands resting gently on her lap. She was smiling at him, the same gentle, patient smile she had always given him. "Mom." Nathan's voice cracked as he took a step forward, his chest tightening. She simply shook her head, still smiling. "Nathan, my love." Her voice was as soft as ever, filled with warmth. "Mẹ, chưa bao giờ trách con." His knees buckled, and suddenly, he was a boy again, rushing to her, sinking to the floor beside her chair. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I should have called. I should have answered." His mother reached out, cupping his face in her hands, her touch light as air. "Shh," she soothed. "Mẹ luôn yêu con, mẹ chỉ muốn con hạnh phúc." Nathan sobbed, burying his face into her lap like he had as a child, but when he looked up, she was gone. He woke with a sharp gasp, his chest heaving, his face wet with tears. The silence in the house was suffocating. And for the first time in his life, Nathan had never felt so empty. Nathan sat up in bed, his breath ragged, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dream had felt so real. Her voice, her touch, the warmth of her presence. For a fleeting moment, it was as if she had never left. But the cold reality hit him like a tidal wave. She was gone. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone on the nightstand. His fingers hesitated over the screen, then almost instinctively, he pressed call on the last number his mother had ever used. He held the phone to his ear, his pulse hammering as he waited. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then an automated voice cut through the silence. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Nathan's grip tightened around the phone. He pulled it away, staring at the screen as if willing it to change, as if willing time to rewind. He tried again, pressing call more desperately this time. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." His breath hitched, his chest constricting as he tried one last time, even though he already knew the truth. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." The finality of it shattered something deep inside him. The line was dead, and so was she. Nathan lowered the phone slowly, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. For years, he had ignored her calls, and now, for the first time, he was calling her. But it was too late. Chapter 5: A Message to You. I never thought I would be the one telling this story. For years, I was the man who was always too busy, too caught up in deadlines, deals, and a never-ending race toward success. I justified every missed call, every ignored message, every promise of I'll call you later. I told myself there would always be more time. I was wrong. My mother spent her last moments waiting for a call that never came. She held her phone in her hands, believing, hoping that I would call back. But I didn't. And now I never will. I carry that weight every day. There is no way to undo what I have done. No amount of success, no amount of regret, no amount of tears will ever bring back the time I lost. But you still have a chance. If your parents are still here, call them. Not tomorrow, not next week. Tell them you love them. Ask them about their day. Listen to their stories, even if you've heard them 100 times before. Because one day, you will reach for your phone, and the number you dial will no longer exist. One day, you will be left with nothing but unread messages, voicemails you should have answered, and a silence so deafening it will haunt you. I was too late, but you don't have to be. Make the call before it's too late. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Let it be a reminder to someone else who might need to hear it. Let's make sure no one else has to live with the regret I do. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of loyalty, love, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Join us as we share stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment.